Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the Meze 109 Pros. These are a brand new or relatively new headphone from Meze Audio. They're the most recent model, but I have been a bit slow to get to them. And they're a $799 dynamic driver headphone. But beyond that, I'm not going to tell you too much more because I've decided to make a few changes in my reviews to hopefully speed things up a little bit. Namely, I'm about to show you the glamour video for the 109 Pros, and all the specifications that you need to know from now on are going to be in the glamour video. What that means is I can jump faster into talking about what matters about the headphone, which are things like build quality, accessories, comfort, etc. And so for those of you that normally skip the glamour videos, I'd recommend you don't do that anymore because I'm going to make it a meaningful use of your time to get all the specification info you might need to know. And so with that said, let's jump into taking a look at the beautiful Meze 109 Pro.
المقاومة للتغيير، المقاومة للحرية، المقاومة للحقوق والعدالة ضد الفساد، الاضطهاد والظلم. من أجل الحياة ننتفض ثورة ما بنقيف ننزف نموت ما بنرجع لا بنرجع لا بخوفنا السلاح. أجيال اتولدت في حروب تحت الخراب والدمار وسط إبادة واستعمار. ديكتاتورية ما بتعيش ما بتعيش.
As you will have just seen in the glamour video, I've already provided you a few ratings for things like comfort and build quality, but let me explain quickly now why I gave the Meze 109 Pros the score that I did. Starting off with comfort, I've scored it as an A because generally speaking, these are a wonderfully comfortable headphone. The only reason they didn't get an A+ from me is that the spring steel headband, and this is going to become a common theme, the spring steel headband, or maybe it's actually the elastic in the suspension strap here, but there's something in the headphone that when you move around it creaks a little bit and it just draws my attention to the fact that I'm wearing a headphone. And that's the only reason that they don't get an A+, is that they don't completely disappear on the head because of that slight sense of sort of creaking and movement when you do move around. But beyond that, they're a wonderfully comfortable headphone. I'm going to come back around to build quality and aesthetics in a second, but before I do, I want to cover off accessories. I scored these as a B+ in the glamour video, and that's because it's a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, you get this beautiful hard case with them, so you can pack them up and either keep them safe from dust, or if you want to travel with them, you can travel, although it is a fairly bulky hard case for these. And so that's great that you get this nice hard case, but then it's a little bit let down by the fact that the cable for the 109 Pros is pretty basic. It doesn't feel like a particularly premium cable, and that's the only reason I've pulled it back a notch. It's no worse than anything else I think in the market around this price point. There's probably a few headphones that come with slightly better cables. And so that's the only thing that's pulled it back for me is the cable quality isn't great. It's not bad by any stretch, but that's why it's a B+ rather than maybe an A. What you also get in the box if you care about this sort of thing is there's a booklet that's all about the 109 Pros and some of the technology that's gone into them, and that's a lovely touch, but I don't really consider that an accessory, so I'm not factoring that in. Putting aside the accessories now, and let's talk a bit about the design and the build quality and the look of these. And that's to say that they're an absolutely beautiful headphone. They're not kind of overly flashy in any way that I can see. They're just more of a classic and classy design. And for build quality and aesthetics, I've scored these as an A- and an A respectively, because generally I do think they're gorgeous and I do think the build quality is excellent. The only thing that holds them back, and I've already mentioned this once, is this spring steel piece here. And the reason for that is that with everything else looking so spectacular, so premium, this just feels and looks a little bit cheap. Not that it's bad, not that it's in any way flimsy, and I understand why it's there from a structural point of view, but it's just not quite as special as everything else on this headphone. When you look at things like these little kind of rose gold V-shaped pieces that attach the suspension band to the spring steel band, it's absolutely beautiful. It's so sculpted. It's so beautifully finished. It just is in a little bit of contrast to a well-finished but a very basic and thin piece of steel. That carries into the cups and the plastic section behind the grille. All of that is absolutely beautifully finished. It looks and feels beautiful, but it's also a beautiful design. And then when you look inside the cups at the covering over the driver, it is nothing short of spectacular, as is the driver itself. And so everything on this headphone would have easily been an A+ if it weren't for the spring steel band up here. That just pulls it back a hair in my boat, but I can't stress enough, for $799 US, these are one of the best looking and feeling headphones I think you're going to come across. A couple of final things to talk about in terms of the build, comfort, general usage is that the headband here is on an elasticized system. I'm not always a fan of these because they can wear out over time, but the good news is it would be very easy to replace this. You've got screws to remove any of the key parts, and one of the things that Meze are great at doing is making their headphones so you can replace things. Something else to mention is I talked about comfort being exceptional on these. It's right up there with an A, and part of that is that they've got these beautiful plush velour pads. They're very soft, very kind of silky feeling pad, and they're very comfortable. They seal well. They're great for long sessions. And so that's another bonus here, is that you've got fantastic pads to help the comfort. And then the final thing I want to mention is that on the bottom of the cups, you've got two 3.5mm cable entries. So this is a dual entry system. It means you can run them balanced if you want to. And again, that's beautifully finished too, with these rose gold surrounds on the actual socket for the 3.5mm plugs. So again, everything is spectacular. It's just this kind of spring steel headband here that lets it down just a little bit. But let's talk now about sound quality, because all of this kind of beautiful design, superb comfort, all of that, the slightly mediocre cable, all of that doesn't really make any difference at all if they sound like trash. And if you've watched some other reviews of these, you'll know that a lot of people have been raving about them. I was fortunate enough to get a pair of the prototypes of these when they came out here for the Melbourne Hi-Fi show earlier in the year. And I was a bit cheeky. I had a chance to have a listen to them. I did some measurements. I didn't go as far as reviewing because that wasn't fair with a prototype, but I was a little bit worried with their tuning. They just had a little bit of extra treble information, or treble energy I should say, and it was throwing the tonality off. But I've got some good news, and the good news is that they've fixed whatever was going on in the prototypes, and it's not a problem with the finished production model 109 Pro. And I think what's changed, because it's very subtle, I think they might have changed the pad materials between the prototypes and this one, because it's almost the same, but it's just fixed the one issue that I had, and that's making for a fantastic sounding headphone. To tell you exactly what I mean by that though, the first two things I noticed about the 109 Pro were the bass extension and the treble emphasis. And that might sound like a bad thing, but it's actually not. So the treble extension that I just mentioned, it's got a really interesting treble emphasis with all of the extra energy up at the very top of the treble frequencies. And what that means is it brings a whole lot of air and high frequency detail into the sound, but it manages to do it in such a way that it's not throwing off the tonality too much. It's very slightly unnatural perhaps, but it's very, very enjoyable. And I'll come back around to that and talk about it more in a second. But before we get to that, let's also talk about the bass extension, which is nothing short of fantastic from a dynamic driver headphone. It's normally planar magnetics that I'm raving about when it comes to bass extension, but these are absolutely brilliant when it comes to bass. They don't have enhanced or overblown bass, they just go all the way down to the bottom. One of the things that all of this turns into is a headphone that is absolutely brilliant on every single genre I've tried it on. And that's really unusual. Often I find headphones that work really well on classical, but then maybe not so well on popular genres like rock, pop, blues, etc. Whereas with these, I can easily turn them to any genre at all, and they sound fantastic. They've got a lovely sense of articulation and clarity to the sound, partly due to that treble, but also just generally their overall tuning and obviously the performance of the driver. And that just means they're a wonderful, detailed sounding headphone without ever getting harsh. And I should backtrack for just a second. One of the things I think is really helping the tonality, the tuning, the general performance of the 109 Pros is the driver technology. What Meze have done is they've combined a combination of biocellulose in the center of the driver with a beryllium coating on the outside. So the theory there, I'm guessing, is that you're going to get some of the speed of the beryllium, but the slightly more natural tonality and decay that something like a biocellulose dome is going to give you. For those not familiar with those terms, biocellulose is basically where they're growing the material in a lab. It's a paper-like material if you're going to oversimplify things. But the point is it's got a different makeup to it compared to, say, a metallized plastic driver. And you definitely hear that in the tonality of headphones like the 109 Pro. It's also what was used on the ZMF Atrium that I absolutely love. And so they've managed to meld both the biocellulose and the beryllium into a fantastic sounding driver. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended products database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list. And then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. Coming back around though to the tuning, what I would describe these as tuning wise is a generally neutral but not at all clinical sounding headphone. Because of that bass extension, there's always a sense of warmth and presence, but there's no enhancement in the bass as I said before. Getting away from tonality for a moment, the staging is what I would call modest. It's not a huge stage. It's not particularly wide left to right, but it does have a very good sense of layering and depth for a headphone at this price point. I'd also say that within the soundstage space available, the separation of sounds is generally very good as well. And I want to put that into context now with a comparison to the HiFiMan Ananda Stealth Edition. The reason I've chosen the HiFiMan Anandas here, and I want to stress this is the Stealth Edition. If you've seen my review of the Stealth versus the original, there's not a vast difference, but I want to be really clear, this is the Stealth Edition that I'm doing the direct comparisons with. The standard Ananda is going to be a little bit further different again compared to what I'm saying here. The reason I've chosen the Ananda Stealth is that for $699 US, it's one of the best headphones on the market in that price point, which is a bit of a funny price point. There's not a lot going on there. There's the Harmonic Dyne G200, there's the Anandas, there's now the 109 Pros, and off the top of my head, I can't think of too many others. And so I grabbed the Anandas because I know them to be a fantastic option at the price, and I've fired them up to compare the two headphones. The first thing to mention is that the Anandas are a little tiny bit more difficult to drive, but neither of these are going to present any issues at all to a general kind of dongle device, desktop device, etc. You could technically drive these from a smartphone if you wanted to, if it's got a headphone output, but for all of my testing I was running them from the Cord Hugo TT2, and what I heard as I listened was that the Ananda Stealths are a more energetic sounding headphone. They're a bit more dynamic, but at the same time they're a harder listen than the 109 Pros. They can get a little bit too bright on cymbals sometimes, and they do separate vocals really nicely in the mix, but they can also get a little bit sibilant on certain sounds within the vocals, of course depending on the recording, but they do have the tendency just to go into that space of sibilance. That is a little bit of a trade-off though, because they also do things like acoustic guitars just beautifully, and that's because that little bit of extra treble sizzle can bring some energy to the transients, the leading edges of notes from things like a plucked guitar string, and that's where the Anandas can sound fantastic. But on the flip side, as I've already said, that can come back and bite you with sibilance in vocals, slightly hot treble in things like cymbals, so it's not all good from the Anandas. Jumping over to the 109 Pros, and the first thing that struck me was they're not pulling apart the sound in the same way. They're not giving me the same sense of separation, the same sense of left-right staging width, but what they are doing is layering a little bit better than the Anandas. The 109 Pros will also still show you if the recording's a bit hot, if there's some distortion or any harshness in the recording. They're absolutely going to show that to you, but they're not going to punish you for it. Whereas the Anandas can at times get a little bit punishing. The bass extension from the 109 Pro is even better than what the Ananda does. The Ananda does seem to have a slight roll off at the very bottom of the bass frequencies, and the 109 Pro doesn't do that at all. And so it keeps a slightly better sense of body throughout the mix at all times, as I said before, without enhancing anything. And I like that tonality from the 109s, whereas I think from the Anandas, they can get a little bit thin at certain frequencies in comparison, and that's because the bass isn't always sufficient to offset some of the treble. Whereas with the 109 Pros, I find that the bass and the treble are really nicely balanced. I spoke about acoustic guitars before in relation to the Anandas, and with the 109 Pros, what I find is that they also give you a really good sense of attack and that sort of leading edge on guitar strums and things like that. But sometimes, and this is probably the one time I find their tuning, that extra treble emphasis in particular, to get a bit too much, is that sometimes that treble emphasis can make the sound of, say, an acoustic guitar being plucked just sound a little bit brittle. It's overemphasizing some of those really high frequency notes that actually we wouldn't hear if we were in the same room as an acoustic guitar. And the end result is a very slightly brittle sound. It's not bad by any stretch, but in comparison with the Anandas, that's what I noticed. A couple of other things to mention as a point of difference is that the 109 Pros do bring the vocals or the main instrumentation, whatever's in that kind of mid-range focal point of the music, it brings it closer to you. And so for those of you that like a more distant listening position from your headphones, the Anandas are going to be better for that, but only if you're happy with that slightly bitey treble, that slightly lesser bass extension, etc. And speaking of bitey treble, the thing that really shocked me as I went back and forth between these two was that I actually find from a tonal point of view, the 109 Pros have more treble. They're a little bit like the HiFiMan Aria in some ways, in that they've got quite a treble emphasized sound, but somehow they've got bass and body and presence as well. And that's the big difference for me going from the Ananda to the Aria, and it's quite similar when you listen to the 109 Pros versus the Anandas. I'm not suggesting the 109 Pros are the same as the Arias, they're not on that level technically, but tonally they're a little bit like the Aria, but I do also find them to be warmer and richer than the Aria. So they're a little bit more trebly than the Ananda, but not as trebly as the Aria. And so after spending lots and lots and lots of time with the 109 Pros, because I just enjoy them so much, they're a headphone that I find to be really well tonally balanced. They probably don't separate sounds as well as something like the Ananda, but everything else about them is just fantastic. The depth and layering they provide, that tonal balance that I've already talked about, the sense of clarity, the insight that they give you because of that extra treble. You hear things in the mix that are a little bit different to what you've heard before. Maybe you've never heard them at all before. And yet it manages to do it all without generally ever throwing off the tonality. As I said before, in direct comparison, you can hear that maybe a guitar strum once every now and again is a little bit over-enhanced in the treble, but it's so minor that you're not going to notice it in a non-comparison situation, and therefore in general listening, it just brings this extra layer of energy and life to the music that I thoroughly enjoy. Something else that I found is that even though they don't kind of separate the sounds as much as something like the Ananda, that actually results in a more coherent overall soundstage for me. When I was going back and forth between the two, I felt like the 109 Pro was the headphone that was more kind of natural and easy to listen to, as I sort of said before. And what I'm putting that down to is the fact that it presents the music naturally. It spaces things out in a very natural way. It doesn't over-separate sounds, but it does give you a sense of layering and a sense of separation. It's not one blob of sound, but it just balances it in a better way for me. And so as you can probably tell, I am incredibly impressed with the 109 Pro. I'm seriously contemplating buying a pair of these for myself. They're a headphone that I've been using for editing, for video calls, for general music listening, for game playing. They're just an absolute all-round headphone. They're obviously not as good as some much more expensive headphones, but as I look through my collection and my database of products, I actually think these could be the very best headphone under $1,500 US. And the reason I'm stopping at $1,500 is that that's where things like the Arias kick in, the Focal Clear MGs, and even the Sendy Peacocks. But there's an argument for the fact that these are equally as enjoyable, maybe more enjoyable than some of those, and they're only $799 US, which sounds like a lot, but not when you're able to get the enjoyment and the musical qualities that something like these provide. And so if you're in the market for a brilliant all-round headphone that looks great, that's insanely comfortable, that just does everything well across all genres, then the 109 Pro is probably one of the easiest recommendations I'm ever going to give on this channel. Personally, I would comfortably recommend it every time over the Ananda, unless you've got a particular desire for extra separation in the sound, or maybe you want the sort of planar magnetic sound. It's a different sense of kind of speed and delivery compared to the 109 Pros and therefore dynamic drivers. But unless you specifically want that, I think the 109 Pros, if you've got that extra $100 above the Ananda price, I think the 109 Pros are an absolute bargain at $800. And so as I said, if you're in the market, check out the 109 Pros for yourself. I think they're brilliant. I think they're very hard to go wrong with. If you've got a pair, if you've tried them, drop in the comments down below how you found them. I'd love to hear from a few other people to see if I'm the only one. In fact, I know I'm not the only one because I've chatted to some channel patrons and they love them too. But I'd be interested to see if there's anyone out there that doesn't like the 109 Pro. It's just, for me at least, such a likeable headphone. And so as always, I hope you found this review useful and helpful. I hope you found the new approach with the tech specs in the B-roll helpful. And if you liked the video, if you enjoyed it, if you found it informative, as always, I'd love it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.